Professor 𝒂𝒓𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆, Professor 𝒔𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆, and my colleagues, invitees. When I was invited to speak on Professor 𝒂𝒓𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆 work, invited by Jeevan actually, I said, look, I was more than happy to speak, but it would be better if someone from Department of Sociology also spoke, and I proposed 𝒑𝒓𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆 name. Now here, 𝒑𝒓𝒂𝒂 and myself, new Peradeniya, appreciating, honoring, paying tributes to old Peradeniya. My background is in literature. My training is in comparative literature, literary theory, post-colonial studies, cultural studies, and so on, being the component of that training. In my speech, I will highlight what Professor 𝒂𝒓𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆's work has been to me as a scholar in above subjects, teaching in Sri Lanka. But let me begin with an anecdote. In 1993, I was a third-year student at the University of Colombo. On one July day, the inter-faculty drama competition was taking place. For the competition, I had written and directed a play. When my play was about to be staged, I peeked through the curtains to take a last look at the panel of judges. The chairperson, and also I wanted to make sure that the panel was ready to see the greatest short play in the world. Right, I wanted to make sure. The chairperson of the panel was an elegantly dressed lady, a beautiful madam, who spoke mostly in English. After many hours, the competition was over, but not the intense discussion of the panel. After a while, however, it ended. My play won all major awards: best play, best script, best actor, and so on. I was the best actor, by the way. Soon after the awards were given away, Professor Sarath Vijayasuriya, then a young lecturer, came to me and said, "Anna Ranjini madam, enna kiwa." I went into that special room, hoping very much that she would not speak to me in English. I was a rural working class background. I spoke very little English when I was an undergrad. Ranjini madam was that elegant lady, the chairperson of the panel of judges. She talked to me in Sinhala and appreciated the play, asked me to meet her at the Loris Road, Bambalapiti, I think, 43, the address, that's where 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 couple of books. When I went to meet her, I took them as well. There we met, not only in that summer, but nearly every summer after that, when 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒃 were on vacation. In one of those conversations, I heard Fulbright for the first time. In 1997, I won it. After winning the scholarship, I had to send out application to universities. I didn't know anything that I didn't have upper middle class relatives to tell me about US universities, blah, blah, blah. Nothing really. Professor Gananath 𝒂𝒂𝒃 mentioned the University of Wisconsin. Now, it is 2023. During the last 30 years, Professor Ranjini 𝒂𝒂𝒃 has been my mentor, friend, and inspiration for working tirelessly in my field. Though history is not always the best judge, let's hope that, Madam, your mentee will be judged fairly. Now, I have to say something. Our acting Vice Chancellor just mentioned about bond violations. I came to the system with a quality PhD without violating any bonds. I those who criticize bond violators in public hardly ever appreciate some of us who came into the system with PhDs, right? I have not received single day of leave for my PhD from the university system, single rupee. So we have several of us in this system. Hardly ever we are appreciated. Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 work has been inspirational for me in many ways. First of all, he has been one of my role models and some other Sri Lankan, First of all, he has been one of my role models and some others in Sri Lankan academia, especially in the faculties of arts, where such role models are extremely rare. He has been an inspiration in speaking truth to power, in keeping a critical distance from the centers of power, and in feeling at home in the loneliness that often comes to you when you keep that critical distance. Let me briefly explain how I have worked some of 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 thoughts into the curriculum that I teach at the Department of Sinhala here at Peradeniya. Last semester, I taught a course, actually as part of a course, recently introduced to our curriculum. I designed the course myself, and it deals with the European colonial representations of Sri Lanka. 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 is, of course, an essential thinker there. Our 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 is equally important, if not even more relevant. None of my students read scholarly books in English. But when I used Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂's cannibal talk and the apotheosis of Captain Cook, translating some sections and explaining some more, my students could see a great thinker at work. They are intelligent enough to see the main point. Cannibalism has been a conceptual tool of colonialism. European colonizers representing certain groups of human beings as cannibals. Even more than sati in India. Sati is bad. No amount of sati should be tolerated, but it was greatly, blown out of proportions by the colonizers. Uma Chakravarti and others has shown that quite well. Even more than sati in India, cannibalistic practices, which were extremely rare, were overemphasized by the colonizers when representing certain groups of people. We have learned from Said's Orientalism that representation of other people, Asian, African, American, and so on, in colonial discourses, those representations are mediated by power. And the power to represent overlaps with power to govern, power to punish, power to murder. In their knowledge and the knowledge of the other, constructed with the aim of subjugating the other, is a form of power. Foucault may have shown us that knowledge is power. 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 work, especially the works mentioned above, shows much more complex picture of that knowledge power axis. Once a discourse is constructed around the subject and the knowledge is produced within that discourse, many people contribute to sustaining it and giving it a life of its own, as the doomed king amply demonstrates. Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 has taught us how to challenge the received knowledge in a field of knowledge. In Medusa's Hair, he challenges Edmund Leach, an intellectual giant of the field of anthropology at that time, and one of his teachers. Such debates are now almost non-existent in our faculty. Some of the debates created by 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 are of global scale. His famous book, Apotheosis of Captain Cook, generated a lasting debate with the famous anthropologist Martin Collins. Two great anthropologists of the time responded to each other by writing book-length responses. The debate generated some other debates. Other famous anthropologists, such as Clifford Geertz, Stanley Thambaiya, and so on, dedicating special conference panels to the 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒔𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 𝑑𝒓𝒐𝒂𝒓𝒂𝒈𝒆 argument was that Hawaiian natives were not epistemologically naive to accept colonizing Captain Cook as a powerful deity of a new order, which was too powerful to resist. Charlie did have some extremely interesting points about what happened when the colonizers made the new world, especially colonizers coming from the old world, Europe, the American continent. But my post-colonial mind tends to agree more with 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒂. So I use those insights in my teaching at the Department of Sinhala. Professor 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂 is the most important theoretically oriented scholar in recent times, especially associated with Sri Lanka. His psychoanalytic approaches and extremely agile, fluid readings of classical historical narratives and historical characters have rendered them much richer than they have been represented in some colonial, nationalist, post-colonial readings and discourses. His book, The Work of Culture, one of my favorite 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂 masterpieces, is an extraordinary work, demonstrating beautifully a great mind of our times at work. One of the greatest prose writers to be produced by Peradeniya and its English department. 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂 uses the paradigm of Oedipus to re-examine historical Buddhist characters such as Ashoka, 𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆𝒓, and so on. Given as a series of lectures in 1982 under the general title of Psychoanalytic Anthropology and Some Problems of Interpretation, the book, Work of Culture, is a rich summary of author's previous work and a demonstration of how a great thinker can work with already familiar materials and yet come up with new insights with surprise, delight, and wisdom. The book, as the case with 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒂 scholarship, is an exhibition of putting English language at work to make rich scholarly arguments in beautifully crafted prose that is not threateningly difficult, but yet deep and complex in thought. In this book, 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒂 revisits his famous argument on the 𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆 conscience and shows us once more, remember, that 𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆 was a complex character with a complex personal history. Estranged from his father, under the shadow of a strong mother, married to a woman of whom the dominant historical narratives prefer to be silent. Having a brother with whom his relationship is the typical case of sibling rivalry. And then, finally, as a king who is forced by the contemporary politics to kill a virtuous king alive. For 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒂, the troubled conscience of Gami as a son, brother, husband, father, and a ruler can be used as a metaphor of reminding us the need for a society conducive to have much more peaceful conscience, not only for rulers, all of us. Not surprisingly, this rich reading of historical events and characters was misunderstood. 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒂 was turned into a national villain in extremely one-dimensional, nationalist, racist Sinhala press. Peradeniya University that produced Peradeniya University that produced 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒂 was to produce scholars to argue that 𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒈𝒆, by extension Sinhala people, has no sense of guilt in their conscience. No wonder that Sri Lanka has descended into the political, ethical, and cultural abyss it is in right now. 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒂 has been a leading critique of European Enlightenment rationalism, In Medusa's hair, he uses the theories of personal symbols and psychoanalysis to understand the mythic religious experience at the level of religious magic. His critique of Western rationalism finds its best expression in Awakened Ones, Phenomenology of Visionary Experience, a stunning book close to my heart. Since I have been a writer and a scholar looking for all possible alternatives to naturalist realism, which is grounded on rationalism. The critique of Western rationalism has been something fashionable in our country, with extreme cultural relativists getting themselves lost in the domain of 𝑁𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂. 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 critique of rationalism is the kind that would not end up producing or promoting racists such as 𝒔𝒔𝒐𝒓. Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 critically defends the Enlightenment tradition, supplementing Cartesian rational cogito with all kinds of other forms of insight, intuition, or vision articulated within the European Enlightenment tradition itself and beyond. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." There, to think means rational thought, thinking rationally. But meditative insight, vision, the sudden vision or the epiphany of poets, or what Freud calls lucid dreaming, have been forms of knowledge in nearly all traditions. 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂's study is the only book-length treatment of these phenomena in recent years, everywhere in the world actually, not only in China. That brings me to another point I want to make. Comparative nature of 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 scholarship. That's the point in this paragraph. Some of his books are large, intimidatingly so, but written in elegant and unpretentious prose. They are invitingly readable. And once you get in, you would not come out of them without feeling of a remarkable expansion in your consciousness and awareness. Take, for example, Imagining Karma, Ethical Transformation in Amerindian, Buddhist, and Greek Rebirth. Before I encountered this book during my PhD years, I did not know that idea of karma as a form of ethical rationality and as a form of causality explaining human life beyond our mundane reality, mundane world, can be used as a theoretical category for intercultural understanding. Karma, idea of karma, he uses as a category of intercultural understanding. Greek, Buddhist, Hindu, all kinds. Karma, not necessarily in the Buddhist sense of the word, has existed in many other cultures. Deep, reflective thinking and philosophical formations on the life after death have not been unique to a single culture. This book, Imagining Karma, as several other 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 books and essays, demonstrates that serious big questions about life, such as the meaning of life, have been raised everywhere. Sometimes human beings have learned from each other the art of asking those big questions. Sometimes similar questions have been asked independent of each other, unbeknownst to each other. In many ways and on many times, 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 scholarship has shown us our shared humanity. I have tried to pass on that message to my students, hoping to get them out of the parochial nationalisms they have been brought up in for decades in our country. Speaking of parochialism, let me touch on Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂's recent book, a lovely little book, The Many Faces of Kandyan Kingdom, that invites us to reconsider the cosmopolitan nature of Kandyan Kingdom through the 16th and 18th centuries. Several Kandyan kings, such as Rajasingha II, enjoyed having foreigners in Canada. While those foreigners were useful as servants, interpreters, craftsmen, soldiers, mechanics, gunners, and so on, it was not for instrumental reasons the king liked having international visitors around. The king enjoyed seeing the many faces of humanity or human culture in his domain. With such cosmopolitan outlooks, the king and the elites were not threatened by the presence of cultural difference. There is no wonder that the subtitle of the book is Lessons for Our Time. In our time, even when we beg for tourism dollars and foreign support, those very nationalist forces that brought the country down can be seen promoting extreme chauvinism and xenophobia. Social theory has been something fashionable in Sri Lanka for decades. But many theory persons are insanely pretentious and esoteric in Sri Lanka, like in English and similar book. Some theoreticians are just name droppers whose pretensions do no more than dulling the epistemological edges, cutting edges of those theories. 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆, in contrast, demonstrates how theories can be applied in analyzing text, rituals, in a way the theories themselves are better honed and sharpened. Medusa's hair is a beautiful example of that. Even when one does not agree with 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 theories, one can still admire the way theories are used. In Medusa's hair, the main theoretical approach was Jungian and Freudian psychoanalysis. The book deals with folk priests and priestesses who perform magical religious acts. Abdin is one of them. That case is really beautiful. I don't have time to explain it in detail. He uses religious trance to bury himself in a grave for hours and come back unharmed. 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 spends years observing him. At one point, 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 asked Abdin if he ever had ejaculation while in the coffin underground. Abdin answers, yes, every time. Perhaps Freud is right in arguing that many of such religious mythical heroics can be sublimations of unfulfilled sexual desires. We really don't know if Abdin lied. 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 was able to ask that question because he had good grounding in psychoanalytic theory. All 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 books are full of such examples. That's why I use this particular case in teaching research method at my department, especially postgraduate courses. But I don't know how many students really learn these lessons. Well, still we have to teach. As a scholar in literature, let me wind up highlighting another hallmark of 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 scholarship, which is so dear to my heart. Professor 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 has a rich literary mind. He has a very rich literary mind. In fact, it runs in the family, 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 family. But it usually a metaphor referring to biological nature of a family, but this is legal, right? Right, 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 family. Gananath, legal love. Gananath and Ranjini are the most celebrated literary couple in the country. In addition to Ranjini translating Sinhala literature into English, Gananath constantly uses literary works in his research. In using literature, especially narratives, for research, 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 does not reduce them to mere facts, but attends to the richness of narrative. Narrative literature, paying attention to layered meanings, connotations, subtext, the meanings of narrative structures, and so on, which requires a great deal of skill in reading literature. You need to have a rich literary mind to do that. That requires deep understanding of how literature works. The younger generation of sociologists of this country must pay attention to the way 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 reads, interprets, and engages with literary works. It was clear from the early work of 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 that the taste for good literature was a hallmark of his work. And his early essays in Sinhala and English attest to the fact that he could have become the literary giant of this country in the generation after Sarath Chandra and Ludovine, had he stayed in the field of English or Sinhala. He would have been the next literary giant after Sarath Chandra and Ludovine. That's my real interpretation. Nearly all of his work contains constant reference to literature, both European, South Asian, Sinhala. I said earlier that Professor Gananath 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 has been one of my role models. Let me now qualify that statement a bit. We have a group of younger academics here at the Faculty of Arts, some of them here, my friends, colleagues, younger friends, who constantly speak of the ways of waking up from the nightmare of mediocrity we are trapped in this faculty. When mediocrity is the majority, the nightmare is for them their sweetest dream ever. A group of us regularly meet informally to discuss this issue. The name 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆, both Gananath and Ranjini, constantly appear in those discussions. Both of them are role models for all of us. But here comes the qualification. I wish Professor Gananath 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 wrote more in Sinhala. If he did so through the 1980s, through 1990s, the parochialism that led to the nightmare mentioned above would not have engulfed all of us. I also wish that the group of excellent scholars made of Gananath, Michael Roberts, Stanley Tambaya, Siri Gunasinghe, Sugatapali D. Silva, Kistiri Malalgoda, C.R. D. Silva, H.L. Seneratne, and so on, did not leave the country. I wish it so much. For example, the vacuum created by Siri Gunasinghe by leaving the country and not writing enough in Sinhala was filled by extremely one-dimensional ideal works of nationalist camp. I have some names I wouldn't read them now. Yet again, if Professor 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 did not leave the country when he did, and if he did not write in English until he became the leading anthropologist in the world, he would not have been able to build up the rich personal library donated to us today. And perhaps he would not have been able to write the great books I mentioned about. I invite younger scholars in our faculty and the brightest of our students to learn your English. Learn it well and come out of your parochial worlds. Here we have now the biography of 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 and his library, a roadmap of his intellectual journey. And make them your own. I own 12 of his books. I can be the only one to own a copy of Pattini book in my generation because it is so rare and expensive. But I do not have time to touch on all of them here. Let's organize ourselves into a group or groups, collectively read 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 books and the 𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒈𝒆 collection. Thank you.